Anyway, let's go on now to look at another aspect of censorship this week. I thought we'd just run through some. I've seen so much attempts to sort of squash stuff, and the big tech giants all seem to be working. It's the first time I've seen, literally the same time, the same day, all three big tech giants take something down, which is why I'm flagging this up as a major news this week. So we're going to have a listen now to, and this is on a different topic. This is to do with Palestine and Israel. Syed Abbas, he's a journalist for Sahar TV. He's based here in the UK, and here he is talking about how his social media post about the Israeli army actually attacking a Palestinian disabled person who was in their wheelchair was censored. He has been booted off of YouTube for, actually, I think he's been suspended for an indefinite period.
Social media was a godsend to many alternative, if you like, narrative journalists or alt media, if you like, because the mainstream media had increasingly quite clearly become government run. Wherever you go, it tended to have a huge stamp of government, if you like, edicts and establishment edicts. So social media was meant to be this big liberation for people who really wanted to express independent truth. What's happened over the last 3 or 4 years, though, is that that huge behemoth, the corporate social media sort of outfit, Facebook included, Twitter, perhaps others, it's increasingly clear that actually things are completely changing now. I think intelligence services, deep state, governments, they've all got involved with using this term fake news as their pretext for moving in on social media and the freedom that people have had to say what they want. I mean, already the freedom was very dubious because algorithms and whatnot are also said to control and manage how far people's words were getting out, and of course primarily their businesses, these sites. So a lot of it, the traffic, could easily be controlled. It's been alleged and said, and I think my case, I guess, is similar to many cases now. I viewed a video which Facebook had allowed to be posted on their site. And often what they're doing is banning people who are reposting videos that they've already allowed onto their system, which is really bizarre in the first place. But my case was really a video of Palestinian man in a wheelchair being kicked over by the Israeli army. Now, it was a pretty graphic video of this wheelchair fellow being kicked over. So clearly one's emotions get a little bit stoked when you see 4 or 5 fully armed soldiers with a track record.
Well, I mean, obviously this sort of thing is very difficult to do on the radio, so what I'll do is I'll put up a link to the video itself on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. But if you could just describe this video and then, you know, what your response was that somebody at Facebook took exception to.
Well, as soon as I saw the video, there was a man in a wheelchair basically having a discussion with 3 or 4 soldiers who were surrounding him with fully weaponized with their machine guns or whatever. These were Israeli soldiers who were being pretty obviously quite loud and nasty to him. One of them chose to flip his wheelchair over so that the man in the wheelchair fell to the ground. You know, this is a sort of unarmed, defenseless, disabled man who goes to the ground, and other soldiers then surround him as well as various other people who were gathered around the incident, and they opened fire. You could visibly see shots being fired at the people around there. So again, it was a sort of example of ongoing Israeli, if you like, oppression of civilians, Palestinian civilians. And in this case, it was absolutely diabolical, a disgusting show of disregard for a disabled man. I mean, what threat could he offer? So I wrote a comment. You put comments up so people kind of get the idea. I only wrote a one-liner on this occasion, and I alluded to the cowardly, rabid dog nature of the Israeli military for that action.
Okay, so you actually used the words cowardly, rabid Israeli dogs.
Israeli military. I said Israeli, not Israel. I said Israeli military dogs. So to me, that's it's a metaphor for basically a pack of wild dogs that attack prey, which is easy for them to eat. So to me, it's a colourful expression. Attack dogs is a common term as well. It's the use of language, but the Facebook's ability to basically just switch off without any recourse to real contesting of the issue, and there's absolutely no clarification of what their community rules are. So they dictate everything, and they dictate the whole kind of scenario. So you can't really do anything. I mean, Palestinian voices, we know, are particularly being stifled within all of this scenario. I mean, I can give you an example of I think it was an organization called, I think, the Palestinian Information Center, which had nearly 5 million followers on Facebook, which was just shut down at a whim. So they're doing this to many, many platforms which aren't conforming to their, if you like, agenda. So Zuckerberg, of course, has also, appointed an actual former Israeli, is the Director General of the Israel's Justice Ministry, who on their oversight board. She was actually appointed on their board to oversee what's going on. Her name is Emmy Palmore, I think, basically Palmore is going to have her own agenda. So if we've got people like this, on the actual board, what hope is there for people like myself or others who are going to express emotionally or otherwise within certain parameters, of course, our expression of disgust at the behaviour.
I'm sure Facebook will say, well, actually, it's our platform. We're a private business. We can censor anyone we want.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the case, but the fact of the matter is that these guys themselves are not really subject to any particular rules and regulations or laws. I mean, there's a lot of things they seem to be able to do and get away with without any recourse. So maybe it calls into the question who actually does monitor and control these particular social media outfits. If it's going to be the usual suspects, if it's going to be the usual Zio Western imperialist institutions, and that's exactly what it seems to be now. They seem to have their hands in that pie. If, of course, Facebook ever was an independent outfit, because all of these transnational corporate companies, ultimately, if you look at the linkage, they're all part of a happy, cozy little cabal, which all works in tandem. We had the situation before where mainstream media was dominated, for instance, in Britain by six, I think, individuals, six major chaps, including Rupert Murdoch, of course, the Barclays brothers. They dominated British media by and large. And now we've got this situation where a handful of these corporate transnational social media outfits are also controlling what people think and say. I think we're just getting basically a takeover of that social media space by the usual suspects behind the scenes. But it's just you've got a new set of people like the Zuckerbergs of the world who are the ones who are fronting this particular area.
Syed Abbas Syed, he works for something called Sahar TV, based here in the UK. Martin, what he's saying there in a nutshell is basically the golden age of the internet is over. He's saying, we had this maybe in the 1960s and 70s and early 80s on television. There was all sorts of great stuff. There was a more balanced journalism. That all got shut down. It started happening in the noughties on the internet. Now that's all being shut down. He's saying that's it. No more golden age of the internet.
Well, I mean, when the internet first came in, the idea was that if you put in a search term, that it will without any kind of bias just lead you to what most people are already looking at. And of course people still presume that that's what's going on when they put in a search term into Google, but it's quite clear it isn't. And of course, this allows those behind these platforms to manipulate public opinion. But of course, they are manipulating public opinion. It's more subtle, but it's not really different in kind from the manipulation of public opinion carried out by, mainstream media for many years.
It's almost like people have been sort of herded around. So we got, literally billions of people herded from one place to another. So you've got mainstream media starts being censorious, lying, etc. And people think, oh, well, I don't really want to watch that anymore. I don't trust it anymore. I'm going to go onto social media. And so as millions and billions of people go onto social media, so it's time for that to be shut down too. I suppose it's possible that there'll be other forms of social media that pop up as alternatives, a bit like that site which slips my mind now, but Edward Snowden started working for them in vk.com or vk.ru, and there are others sort of popping up as alternatives to Twitter. So I think one of the things I'll do on my show page tonight at thisweek.org.uk is put up a link to a couple of those, an alternative Facebook and an alternative Twitter. But this does suggest that this is being done for a purpose, doesn't it? Is it just being done for money, for big pharma, for the arms firms? What ultimately is the aim of all of this?
Well, I mean, those are the big questions. I mean, basically, the deep state in the West is beholden to the banksters, and it's beholden to the military-industrial complex. And if when you start thinking, well, what's the motive behind all of this, you start to realise what's going on. They're basically trying to control the 21st century in the way that they control previous centuries, but they're finding it difficult to do.
If you think about those tech giant companies, Twitter, Facebook, Google, in fact, including all sorts of other ones like Amazon, LinkedIn, these are all Bilderberg firms. In fact, the bosses are going along to the Bilderberg meetings over the years, and we're supposed to believe, apparently, that there's no Bilderberg meeting this year. Well, I'm quite sure there have been, certainly, of the steering committee. And the interesting thing about that for me is that over the years, that sort of organisation, which is basically a private lobby in the NATO countries of the most powerful and wealthiest people, in a group which was started by a former Nazi SS officer back in the 1950s, is that it started off as banking and oil. Now it seems that information is the main key there, is that actually controlling the news is what these modern day Nazis really want to do.
Yeah, well, there's been a development arc of all of this, hasn't there? And they are what they're trying to do now is, at one stage, the internet was a kind of alternative forum, but now, of course, groups like Brigade 77 and the Integrity Initiative and all of these kind of basically quasi-state intelligence service groups are basically involved in manipulations on social media and also...
Well, they're cutouts, aren't they, really?
Yeah.
So the idea is that you've got a private organisation, MI5, MI6, whoever else can say, or in fact even a particular individual arms company that's paying for them, to say, oh, it's nothing to do with us, folks.
Well, that's actually... So you've got Bellingcat, Elliot Higgins, who's basically, he was basically supposedly unemployed, and then he became an expert on Syria just by looking at online. And of course, he's presented in the mainstream media as independent journalist Elliot Higgins of Bellingcat. But in actual fact, Bellingcat is funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, British government, etc., etc.
NATO.
So they pretend. There's a pretense. It's like astroturfing.
Is it the Atlantic Council?
Yes, it's astroturfing. So they've got all these things out there which look as if they're independent sources, and in actual fact they're part of the government.
I mean, it's interesting. One of the best places to go to look at whether a source is really independent or not is a place called Spinwatch. That's run by Professor David Miller here at Bristol University, and he's recently been booted out of the Labour Party, hasn't he?
He has, yeah.
As an anti-Semite. So anyway, going back to Mohsin Abbas Syed's censorship, I thought it'd be interesting to ask him, because this is all focused around the Israel-Palestine conflict, as so much seems to be, about the Israel lobby and how it actually operates online. So let's have a listen to that now.
The Israel lobby's job is to make sure that Israel exceptionalism in the world is maintained. They have that exceptionalism. They had it for decades already. They just want to go to the next level. Nothing should be questioned. There's this kind of desire for everybody to keep their mouths shut as Israel becomes more and more totalitarian, which it has to, because Israel is illegitimate, is surrounded now by a new wave of, if you like, especially Arab descent, called the resistance axis. It includes people that they've already prescribed now as terrorists, because, again, the same institutions, Israeli exceptionalist institutions, have kowtowed to their desires to name whoever they want as terrorists. So what they've done is they've really cleared the ground for any opposition to what they want done in the Middle East, in that region, from the Western sources. So stopping Britain, the Netherlands, America, all of these powerhouses with their wealth, with their influence, with their democracy, with their talk about liberal democracy and human rights. Well, that's all been silenced now. You can't squeak, because the minute you say anything against the Israelis, or you say anything against Zionism or Zionists, the Israeli lobby will trigger whatever they have in terms of blackmail, whether it's through the blackmail of being termed an anti-Semite, or other blackmail, because, so you don't forget that these guys, Israelis, have got the Unit 8200, they've had the Talpiot program, which essentially has high-tech chaps who are distributed across the entire Western world now as well. And they are, so in extension to the Facebook argument, you've got these guys from the Talpiot program. Look up the Talpiot program that Israel has, which develops some of the highest powered techies who are then distributed into important positions around the Western world. Now, it's this kind of, if you like, influence, this kind of direction of political policy in the West, which is what they want. And they've got their people all in place. They've got the money men in place, the money lenders and the money mafias, money power. They've got that on their side, and they intend to use that to manipulate things.
I mean, tell us a bit more about this Talpiot program, because that sounds to me as if you're saying that they're deliberate infiltrators, but then it might just simply be that the Israelis have got such good education systems around IT that their people are snapped up around the world.
Well, $35 billion of aid from America pours into Israel, not without reason. There's the entire diaspora of money mafia, which also pours in privately funding to these institutions. Keeping Israel on its feet requires a lot of money, and it gets that money. And the Talpiot program, of course, if you've got industrial espionage, if you've got individuals dotted out around everywhere, if you have influence in the Congress, and if you have influence in the British Parliament through the lobbies, whether it's IPAC or whether it's the Israeli, the Friends of Israel here in the Conservative Party, etc., if you've got such power and a fantastic organization, without a doubt, they've got an immensely powerfully organized network of intelligence, of influence politically, of influence financially. And of course, they'll use it to survive, and to not only survive, but to actually dictate where things are at and where things will go. And I think the Talpiot program is just one visible example of which they happen to have released to show off, to say, look, this is the scale of power we have. But let's get down to the brass tacks. This internet we're talking about, ultimately, the flow of traffic through this internet, I've read reports where it's alleged that this traffic actually all passes through the Israeli networks. And ultimately, if Mossad and if these networks have access to codes, well, how far does it go? Does it mean that the Israelis have actually secretly, do they have access to nuclear codes, of whether it's the British nuclear weapon systems or whether it's the American weapon system? Is that why Israeli exceptionalism is so easily acquiesced?
Well, I don't think the Royal Navy or the British Army or whatever would put their nuclear codes anywhere near the internet. I hope they wouldn't anyway.
Well, one would hope not, but I'm just wondering that if the level of infiltration, I mean, all of these codes ultimately if they're going to punch, are they going to be punched in manually? Do they get punched in? Who keeps these codes? Where do they store them? I mean, my question is, the deep state and the shenanigans that go on there, and Israel's actual power within that field is very, very worrying. And I think to underestimate what they're capable of and what they actually do is really highly naive, given the scale of infiltration. Look, we constantly talk about Russia influencing our elections, yet nobody squeaks about Israel and its influence over parliamentary groups. Nobody talks about the funding and finance that goes to parliamentarians. Why not? Why isn't that an issue? Whereas Vladimir Putin is constantly, even today, being accused of having a hand in either American election gerrymandering or the British elections, but nobody talks about what's openly in our face, which is that Israel and Israeli lobbies and those forces that are found out across our systems, and if they're embedded to the structural systemic order, how far does that go? I mean, and would any investigating journalist even get as far as being able to suss out how far that goes these days? I doubt it. I mean, these days you're getting slammed for saying that the Israeli army are barbaric, dog-like creatures for attacking wheelchair-bound people. I mean, far less would anybody be able to go out and investigate the depth of what Israeli power and control is.
Yes, I mean I think in a way that's the most powerful point he makes. Right towards the end there, Martin, where he's talking about the criticism of Russia, but no criticism of Israel for influencing elections. Now we know that there are extremely powerful lobbies here in the UK and in the United States, directly funded through this $40 billion or so that goes to Israel every year.
Yeah, well, and this all came out in the lobby, the Al Jazeera programme. Where the Mossad agent, whose name now escapes me, says, well, we've got £1 million to spend to get the Labour Party to do what we want it to do. And, of course, that £1 million isn't from Israeli taxpayers. That's ultimately US taxpayers' money. It's extraordinary that Israel is in receipt of massive amounts of taxpayers' money when it's basically a developed country.
The guy's Shai Massot.
Why do they get all this help?
Shai Massot, who was one of the attachés at the Israeli embassy, he was going around, basically offering money and bribes in order to remove politicians of various sorts.
Well, he said he was going to get rid of Alan Duncan, didn't he?
Including in serving politicians in the government. So, that does seem to be better evidence than the evidence of Russian interference. Well, why is the media, do you think, Martin, why is it so biased against Russia and pro-Israel?
Well, I mean, basically what we're talking about here is warfare and propaganda, isn't it? So the Russians are the enemy for the deep state in the West. The Israelis are allies, just as the Saudis are, and therefore they're given, whitewashed and encouraged, and we're supposed to think of them as people like us. Whereas, of course, the Russians, well, their eyes are too close together and they don't think like us.
This is all very much like racism, isn't it? Now, is there a sweet spot beyond which, if you push the propaganda, it stops working?
I think that's true. I mean, the only thing you can say about the crazy level of propaganda to which the population is now subjected is that eventually it becomes, it looks like the majority of the population really think there is something behind the idea that Russians are fixing elections in Britain, which is pretty ridiculous when you think about it, because the evidence just isn't there.
So if you tell a lie enough times, that people start believing it. Yes, and the bigger lie, the better.
Well, I mean, if you think about this, the idea that the Russians are influencing elections really comes back to the leak of the DNC emails, which showed that the Democratic National Committee in the US was rigging the primaries in the run-up to the 2016 election to make sure that Bernie Sanders didn't win. Now, even if the Russians had basically got that material and put it out there, the fact would remain that what was going on is the elections being rigged. But of course, they instead of going over the election, the CIA basically said, well, this makes America look really, really bad. It looks like we're rigging elections, and that must be the Russians' fault. No, it's not the Russians' fault. It's your fault. You're the ones who are rigging the elections, not the Russians.
So are the Israelis rigging the elections?
The Israelis are much more active in trying to rig elections in the West, specifically in the US, but also in the UK.
So how do they do that?
How do they do that? Because they've got a lot of money to spend on social media and all the rest of it. They've got time to go and find our friend that was talking earlier and take his video down, because they're being paid for by US tax dollars being given to Syed in Israel to do these jobs. And of course,
what do you mean by that, Syed?
Well, Syed are people who work for Israeli intelligence, but they're not directly employed by them. So
the sympathisers.
Yeah, the sympathisers and
agents of influence.
Agents of influence, and so on. Now, basically, as you can imagine, people all around the world, whoever they are, governments, organisations, individuals, are trying to influence events by using media and other mechanisms. But of course, it's a very unequal struggle.
Well, you can influence events, can't you, if you can get a politician to sign on the dotted line because you've got evidence of their crime or their paedophilia gathered through people like Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, well, I mean, the point about Israeli intelligence services is they are incredibly active. They're not just a kind of passive little group that sort of, tries to prevent threats to the state. They are proactive. They've got a long-term view. They clearly want a war with Iran. Let's just remind everybody. Netanyahu wants to go to war with Iran. Anybody listening to this has got to decide whether they want to go to war with Iran, because that's what's going to happen, and then you're going to be at war with Iran. Do you want that? Did you wish for that? Because if you didn't, you better speak up now.
Okay, well, generally, apparently people believe that Donald Trump is fighting against a secretive, evil global cabal, members of which include former Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. Now, this is a conspiracy theory called QAnon. I'm not quite sure what that term